Right now, in the dark, something strong enough to peel the roof off a barn is throwing itself against a thin shell of hide and wooden poles, and it is losing. It has been screaming against that shell for hours, and the shell is still standing, and the family sleeping inside it has not so much as stirred. So here is the question worth staying for. What kind of house can hold against a 100-mile-an-hour gale, keep a family alive at 40 below, and then be gone before sunrise without leaving so much as a scar in the ground? Most people think they already know. They picture a tipi, a simple cone of hides, a romantic prop from the Old West, a tent with a fire in the middle. But that is not a tent. It is a fortress. One that wins the fight in a way no fortress of stone would ever dare. Because out on the Great Plains, a bad design was never an inconvenience. It was a sentence. Winter did not simply punish the unprepared. It erased them. And that thing clawing at the walls tonight? By the time the sun comes up, it will have failed 4 separate times. 4 times it found a way to kill everyone inside, and 4 times the lodge quietly turned it aside. To understand how, we have to rewind and count those failures one by one. Because tonight we are not looking at the tipi as a symbol, we are looking at it as a machine built for one purpose: to win a war it could never fight head-on. A machine that turned crosswinds into downward force, smoke into breath, animal skin into armor, an open, killing prairie into a place where a family could hold the line until morning. This is Dark Origins. To understand the fight, you first have to understand the battlefield, and the Great Plains are almost always described wrong. People call them empty. Empty is the wrong word. Empty suggests something passive, something waiting. The plains are none of that. They are active, violent, and mechanical. From Texas up into the Canadian prairies, there are almost no mountains to break the air, and almost no forests to slow it. So the wind gathers speed across 1,000 miles of open grass, and by the time it reaches you, it does not blow. It sweeps. So stop thinking of it as weather. Think of it as an army 1,000 miles wide. It has no single front you can face, and no exposed flank you can slip around. It comes at every wall from every direction at once, and unlike any human army, it never tires and never sleeps. Against that army, the human body loses on every front at the same time. Heat pours off you by convection as the wind strips it, by radiation into the open black sky, and by conduction straight down into frozen ground. There is no single point of failure to defend. There are 3 running at once. In that kind of cold, exposed skin becomes a timer, and you could hear the enemy change its mind. The long, high howl of the wind would drop into a lower, heavier growl as the temperature crossed some invisible line, and that shift in sound was how people out there knew the night had stopped forgiving mistakes. Now try to hold ground against that with stone or heavy timber. The plains break them. The earth freezes, thaws, and heaves until it works your foundations loose. Tall timber is scarce. Hauling beams across open country burns the human and animal strength you cannot spare. And worst of all, a fixed wall chains you to one spot while the bison, the water, and the season all march away without you. But the army carried 3 weapons, not 1. 2 of them you already fear, the wind and the cold. The third had no name, made no sound, and it did not come at you from the outside at all. The answer to all of it was never going to come from mass. It came from geometry. Here is the simplest way to understand how geometry fights back. If you raise a flat wall on the open plains, the wind sees a handle. A broad, upright face gives it exactly what it wants. Something to grab, something to lean its whole 1,000-mile weight against. And once it has that grip, it works you from 3 directions at once. Pressure piles against the face. Air spilling over the top drops into suction that lifts from above. Turbulence churns in the dead air behind. Push in front, lift overhead, tearing at the back, and no wall was ever built to be attacked from three sides by forces that refuse to arrive one at a time. So the Tipi simply refuses to hand the wind a handle. That is the storm's first failure of the night. It comes looking for a flat wall to shove, and it never finds one. Because from a distance, the lodge reads as a plain cone, and it isn't. It is a tilted cone, and that single detail is the whole trick. Plains lodges were commonly pitched with the back set steep into the prevailing wind, and the front carried longer and shallower, so the storm never met a blunt face. It met a slope. It was forced to split and slide instead of slamming and stalling. And then the slope does something that sounds impossible. That pressure stops trying to peel the cover upward and turns instead into compression, running straight down the poles, driving their feet harder into the earth. Sit with that, because it is the entire secret. The storm does not tear the lodge away. The storm drives it home. The enemy's own weapon becomes the stake that pins the fortress down. That is the first principle hiding inside the shape. Do not fight the dominant force if you can redirect it. A stone fortress resists the wind and dares it to win. A teepee lets the wind in on the plan and puts it to work. Underneath the skin, the frame keeps the same faith. It starts with 3 poles, because 3 points always define a plane. And on prairie ground that is frozen here, rutted there, and sloping in a third place, 3 legs always find their footing where 4 would rock. Lash them near the top, raise them, and lean the rest into that cradle. A dozen poles on a small lodge, 20 or more on a large one. And here the plains teach something our own century forgot. We worship stiffness. We call rigidity strength. Out there, the opposite was true. Slender lodgepole pine was allowed to bow under a gust instead of snapping, and the rawhide lashings were never dead joints. Tied wet, they shrank as they dried into a grip that tightened itself, and still kept enough give to pass the stress along. And you could hear it. The whole lodge would groan, lean, and spring back, breathing like a chest under the wind. That was the storm's second failure, and its third. It tried to snap the frame, and the frame bent. It tried to shake it apart, and the frame simply breathed. The frame answers force. The cover is the curtain wall, and a fresh bison hide makes terrible armor. It comes off the animal, heavy, wet, and biologically unstable. Left alone, it stiffens, rots, and fails within days. It is useless until it is forged, and forging it was real work. Scraped clean of flesh and hair, worked soft by hand, then brain-tanned or cured in smoke depending on the region. And the finished plate had to do 4 contradictory jobs at once. Shed water, resist tearing, stay supple in killing cold, and still roll up light enough to march. And here is a fact that should stop you. A whole camp, hundreds of these lodges, could strike and vanish in about an hour. That is not panic. That is not people fleeing. That is a standard of logistics that most real armies in history would have envied. The plains fielded a fortress that could dissolve on command. Even so, a sealed fortress kills the people inside it. This one had to breathe, and that is what the smoke flaps are for. They are not a chimney, they are control surfaces. By angling them against the wind, the people inside could shape the pressure over the opening and pull the smoke column up and out. The wind shifts in the night, you rise and reset them. A fixed hole in a roof is a weakness. An adjustable one is a control system. Which brings us, at last, to the third weapon, the one with no name and no sound. It was moisture. And it was the cruelest trick winter had, because it never needed to breach a single wall. It turned the breath of your own sleeping family into a traitor. All night that breath rose, condensed on the freezing inner face of the cover, and fell back down as damp onto the hide robes. Wet hide stops holding heat, and so people were beaten from the inside, going still inside the warmest thing they owned, killed by nothing more than the fact that they were alive and breathing. The counter to that is the quietest object in the whole structure. A second wall hung around the poles and running only partway up. The narrow gap it opens changes everything. Cold air seeping in at the base is caught in that channel and drawn upward instead of crawling across the floor and over sleeping bodies, warming as it climbs and feeding the very draft that carries the smoke away. Water running down the inside of the cover follows the same channel to the ground, nowhere near the beds. One thin strip of hide, hanging in silence, the last line of defense against an enemy no arrow could ever touch. And here is the strangest thing about this fortress of all. When the battle is won and the season turns, it does not stay to hold the ground it defended. It takes itself apart and disappears. What kind of fortress refuses to remain a fortress? At the center of the whole defense sat the fire, and the fire was never trying to make summer. It was after something harder to win: stability. Keep the drafts off the body, keep the bedding dry. Hold one steady zone where people could rest and recover between rounds. The door faced east, toward the morning light. The hearth held the middle, and the places where people slept and sat were arranged around the wall by custom and by blood. Which means the social life of the lodge and its thermal performance were never two separate things. They were one design. And then, when the season turned, the entire fortress came down. It is tempting to call that a weakness, as if a people who had to move had settled for less. That gets it exactly backward. Mobility was not the price of the tipi. It was a weapon. The poles that held the roof became the travois that dragged the load, and every single part had to earn the weight it cost you. So why build a fortress and then walk away from it? Because the strongest defense on the plains was never the thickest wall. It was refusing to give the enemy a fixed target at all. You cannot besiege an army that has already left. Winter would arrive in full force and find nothing waiting but flattened grass and a ring of cold ashes. And that points to something deeper than engineering. The West built fortresses to seize the land and force it to submit. The Plains peoples built homes to belong to the land and move with it. What we were taught to call primitive turns out to be a treaty with the world, one we are only now, reluctantly, beginning to learn again. So, one last time, what kind of house survives a 100-mile-an-hour gale, holds a family at 40 below, and vanishes before sunrise without leaving a scar? Not a tent. It was never a tent. Its genius was never that it stood. Its genius was that it could not be caught. Strength without mass. Safety that never became a prison of material and fuel. A victory won by refusing to stand still. And it leaves us with questions we still haven't answered. How much energy does shelter actually need? How do you live in a place without consuming it? The Plains gave one answer, and it was not concrete, and it was not steel. It was poles, hide, airflow, and fire. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe to Dark Origins, because the deeper you look into the past, the harder it becomes to keep calling it primitive.